With me is Arieb Azhar, who I'm sure you all know. We're just going to have a short little chat with Craig, and then we're going to open it to all of you to ask questions, because I think it's much more exciting if the audience is involved rather than just listening to two people rabbit on. So, Craig, if we can just start the session today, if you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then from there we can move into more specific areas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. And I've been here in Karachi for a couple of days now, and I must say I've had the most overwhelming welcome. People have been so very friendly and so very hospitable. And I've never been invited to so many people's homes, ever. And when people invite you, you can tell they actually mean it, which is extremely pleasant. I'm really having a very good time here. My name is Craig Murray. I'm a retired diplomat, a retired British ambassador. I spent 20 years in the British diplomatic service. I finished my career. I was Deputy High Commissioner in Ghana, in Accra, and then my final posting was as British Ambassador in Uzbekistan. And at that time, my career ended somewhat prematurely from having been Britain's youngest ambassador and a high flyer. But essentially, I couldn't agree, I couldn't go along with the so-called war on terror, with the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, and in particular, the policies of torture and extraordinary rendition, which I came across in my work. So at that stage, I decided enough was enough. I got into a very large argument with Tony Blair and Jack Straw on the subject. Whether I resigned or whether I was sacked is a moot point. I don't really mind which way you put it, but my career finished then. I then went on to do other things. I became rector of the University of Dundee, which was my former university. I went back to Africa again. I was asked to take over the chairmanship of an electricity company in Ghana. The president asked me to take it over because of the terrific amount of corruption they were suffering. I did that, and since then there have been 4 new presidents from 2 different political parties, and I'm still the chairman, so I must be doing a reasonably good job. And I also spend my time writing, doing political blogging, writing history and researching history, which is what my first passion was and what I had originally intended to do with my life. And also because of blowing the whistle on torture and extraordinary rendition, I became closely associated with WikiLeaks. So I'm nowadays work quite a lot with WikiLeaks. Until recently, when access to the embassy has been cut off, I was one of Julian Assange's closer associates, and I still am, although I can't physically see him anymore. So that's another side to my life. So it's been, let's say, an unusual career path and quite an adventurous life, and I'm still enjoying new aspects, and I'm still enjoying meeting new people and meeting new experiences.
So just picking up from a few things you said, one was, of course, I believe you got a first class at Dundee, and that you went into the diplomatic service because you sat the exams because some girl you were interested in was doing the exam. So you went and sat that and got a position, I think 2nd or 3rd in the whole of the UK. So they said you better join, and you went into the diplomatic service. But we have an electricity company in serious trouble in Karachi, so maybe we should, get the governor to hop across quickly right now. I'm sure he's next door, and perhaps we can, sort our own problems out. But on a serious note, tell us a little bit about Africa, because you'd imagine that the conditions in Africa were also pretty bad, despotic, all kinds of corrupt regimes, and then Uzbekistan being the same. What was Africa like, and then how different was Uzbekistan? And why were the priorities different for the British government?
Yeah, well, it's quite I had quite a long history in Africa. I started my career as head of a political desk for Africa in the Foreign Office. Then I was posted to Nigeria. Subsequently, I became deputy head of the African department in the Foreign Office, and then I was posted to Ghana. So I had several phases of my career in Africa. And I was also head of the UK delegation to the Sierra Leone peace talks, trying to negotiate peace in Sierra Leone. And there were some, very interesting things in those different phases. When I was appointed the political officer for South Africa in the Foreign Office, it was in 1984, and at that time we had a Conservative government again under Margaret Thatcher, and it's interesting how truth gets whitewashed by the media and by society. And nowadays it's quite hotly denied, but Thatcher herself, certainly, and several of her ministers, though by no means all, Thatcher was sympathetic to apartheid. She certainly was extremely hostile to any moves to do anything to stop apartheid. And I know from personal experience, I can say to you that she may not exactly have been she never came out in public as a supporter of apartheid, but she certainly didn't see it as the uncomplicated evil that most of us saw it as. And an awful lot of interests in the Conservative Party were very pro the apartheid government. And that was a very difficult time for me. In my very first job, in my very first week, I had to sign letters on behalf of the government which said that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist and he should be in prison, because that was the position of the British government at that time. So obviously, Uzbekistan wasn't the first time I encountered an ethical dilemma. And I think that was my first real insight into, if you like, the inside story of how commercial interests and commercial lobbying are what really controls government rather than principles in any sense. Skipping through the years, obviously I saw much more of that in Nigeria. I got in trouble in Nigeria for writing a report on the activities of Shell in the Delta region, on the environmental pollution Shell were causing, which was appalling, and in which Shell were really not interested, and in Shell's support for the dictatorship, which was then the Babangida dictatorship in Nigeria. And I made friends, for example, with Ken Saro-Wiwa, the writer who was eventually actually hung but by a military dictatorship for his principled opposition to what was happening in the Delta region. So and that was the first time I came directly into conflict with my own government I was working for. They told me to shut up about what was happening in the Delta because it affected British oil interests. And I did shut up. I stopped pursuing the subject because I'd been ordered to. And I should say I was a career civil servant. I was an ambitious man. You don't actually become Britain's youngest ambassador by being an angel. And I wasn't an angel. I was pursuing my career with tenacity. The next time I got into trouble with my own government was in Poland, where we were instructed to lobby the Polish government to make the warnings on cigarette packets smaller, because the British American tobacco in particular and British tobacco interests didn't like the fact the Polish government had passed a law, I think, and this is now true in most countries, and we now have exactly the same thing in the UK. Back then, and I'm talking the mid-1990s, we didn't have such laws in the UK, or at least we had small warnings. Was the Polish government had done a sort of full cigarette packet warning about the health dangers. And I was instructed to tell Poland that Poland wanted to join the European Union, and there was a European Union standard size for the health warnings. And so the Polish government had to make their health warnings on cigarette packets smaller. I was at the time first secretary and head of a political section in the embassy in Warsaw. and I went to see my ambassador and said, we've received this instruction to lobby for smaller warnings on cigarette packets. I can't do that. I'm sorry, I just can't do that. And my ambassador, whose name was Michael Llewellyn-Smith, who was a lovely man, he said, no, it's a stupid instruction and just threw it in the bin. And he sent back a telegram reporting that we had done it, even though we didn't. So that's how we dealt with that one. But I'm sorry, you'll find this happens a lot. I will just discourse on miles from your question. But in Ghana, I again ended up, while I was Deputy High Commissioner, with another warning from government, because I made a speech about corruption in Ghana. The UK government was having an anti-corruption week. I was acting High Commissioner at the time, and I'd actually received an instruction to make a speech about corruption in Africa. But when British diplomats make a speech about corruption in Africa, you're meant to say it's all the Africans' fault. Whereas what I said was that in every corrupt deal, there is a Western company at the other end of it, and there's a Western bank processing the money, and there are Western accountants signing off for false accounts, all of which is true. But it wasn't what the British government really wanted me to say, so that was the next time I got into disciplinary trouble. But then, none of which ever seemed to stop me getting promoted, which I never did quite understand. But then, on my next posting as ambassador in Uzbekistan, I came across active complicity in torture and extraordinary rendition. And finally, I discovered the issue on which I just couldn't find, there was no way around it. You either basically had to be damned, had to go along with things which no decent human being could possibly go along with, or you had to give up. And at that stage, I gave up. And I do apologize. That was a much longer answer than your question.
If I may jump in over here, I knew nothing about you till 3 days ago. And when I was asked to be part of this panel, and then I Googled you. And you've led quite an extraordinary life from what little I gleaned. And I think have always been outspoken in your views against different regimes. You joined the Liberal Party at, I think at the age of 15, you refounded the North Norfolk constituency. So since then, you've had very strong-held views of your own. And your experience, of course, in Uzbekistan, which we'll come to, and what your previous book was about, Murder in Samarkand. But before that, I'd just like to ask you about when you were working for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Embargo and Surveillance Center. And that entailed monitoring Iraq's government's compliance to weapons and trade embargo. And what was that experience like? And what did you find while you were working there? Was it in line with what the British government claimed when they invaded Iraq with the USA? Or
well, I should say that my period of being in charge of the Foreign Office unit that monitored the embargo was a few years before the last British invasion of Iraq. So it wasn't in the immediate run-up, it was in the embargo sometime prior to that. I mean, that was absolutely a fascinating period of my life. We were in a secret underground unit in London, which was actually built as bomber command during the Second World War. It's very, very secret, but I can tell you it's in an underground car park in Marsham Street. And it's actually very much like a James Bond movie, because you go down to the second level of the underground car park, and you enter a cleaner's cupboard. And at the back of the cleaner's cupboard are shelves with paint on and things. And you enter a combination, and the shelves and paint slide aside, and you can then go in. And but we had the Embargo Surveillance Center was a joint FCO, Department of Transport, Secret Intelligence Service, MOD operation, and GCHQ. But we had a shift of 60 Royal Navy personnel who were doing the charting and mapping, who would come in a coach every 8 hours a day, because it was a 24-hour operation. And every 8 hours, a coach would draw up outside this cleaner's cupboard, and 60 people would walk into the cleaner's cupboard. And every half hour, 60 other people would come out of the cleaner's cupboard. So this must be the least secret installation in the world. I always found that absolutely hilarious. But we were still supposed to maintain the fiction that nobody knew about it. An awful lot of British society consists of the fiction of pretending you don't know things that everybody does know. Anyway, I mean, that was fascinating. And the learning, I mean, a great deal of the time, what I was accessing was of course, material from GCHQ and SIS, but it was also a great deal of material which was mostly picked up by GCHQ, but banking transfers in effect, watching the flow of dark money around the world and the interchange between narcotics money and arms money, watching the arms dealers who are getting arms into Iraq, and realizing that a lot of major Western arms dealers were implicated in that. There were some reports to which the answer would come back, turn a blind eye. But from that period and from my contacts I made in that period, even though it was a few years later, the report came out, the dossier of Tony Blair on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, I had sufficient background knowledge, and I still knew sufficient of contacts to ask to know that that was simply untrue, that the dossier was a pack of lies. But more importantly than that, I had enough knowledge to know for certain that the dossier wasn't accidentally false. It was deliberate lies. Tony Blair set out a prospectus against Iraq, which he knew to be untrue. I actually bumped into an old friend of mine, Bill Patey, who was also from Dundee University, and Bill later became ambassador to Iraq and ambassador to Afghanistan. I met Bill in a Foreign Office corridor shortly after the WMD dossier was published. And Bill at the time was head of Middle Eastern department, so he was one of the people who had to sign off the dossier. And I said to him, Bill, is there something I don't know? No, has something happened? Have we got a new source? Well, this just can't be true, is it? And he looked at me and he laughed. He said, no, of course, Craig, it's bollocks. And he's one of the people who actually signed it. He didn't. He did. And if you read the Chilcot report, you have to do a certain amount of reading between the lines. But from the Chilcot report, it's very obvious that the people who produced the report knew it was false. And obviously that, knowing that we were invading a country on the basis of lies about that country's military capability, and knowing that millions of people were going to die as a result of those lies, was a major part, because it was, I think, February or March of 2003 that the Gulf War, the last invasion of Iraq, started. And it was 3 months after that I was suspended from the Foreign Office for my protests about torture and extraordinary rendition. The things are all mixed in, and it was all a major part of my disillusionment with the Foreign Office.
And that disillusionment came to a head when you were appointed ambassador to Uzbekistan in 2002. And shortly after you arrived there, there was a horrible incident involving the boiling alive of two Hizbul Tahrir activists. Was that the first indication was that what really made you question everything, or were things prior to that also?
The first indication, I went to a trial of 6 convicted members of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan who were sentenced to death. And I went to see the trial for myself to try to get a feel for what's happening, which the authorities weren't keen on. They weren't keen on me being there, but I insisted. And the trial was a complete farce. Plainly it was fixed, it was rigged, and it really was a joke of a procedure. And the accused were in a cage, and the judge was yelling and abusing at them during the course of the trial. And there was one old man gave evidence. And in an Uzbek court, they don't have a separate place for the witnesses. So you're sat in the courtroom like the audience are here. And some of you may be a spectator, and someone might be a witness. Then when that witness is called, they just stand up where they're sitting and give their evidence. And it happened, I was sitting immediately behind this old man who gave evidence. And he stood up and he said that he wanted to withdraw his evidence, that what he had said wasn't true, and that his sons had been tortured in front of him until he signed his evidence.
Wow.
And I was, as I say, I was within touching distance when he gave that. And sometimes you can just tell when a person is telling the truth. You just feel that person is telling the truth. It's not something it's easy to rationalize how you know that, but I just felt very strongly that what this man was saying was true, and his sons had been tortured in front of him until he gave evidence. So that was when I very first questioned what was going wrong. Then it was only literally a very few days after that when an old lady came to see me, and she brought me photographs of the body of her son, who was from Hizb ut-Tahrir, and had been tortured to death in I'm forgetting the name of the town, but somewhere near Samarkand. And the photos were awful. The condition of the body was unspeakable. And I sent them back to the pathology laboratory because she'd taken detailed photos. She'd been given the body for burial in a sealed casket and ordered, and of course, being Muslim, she would immediately bury the body anyway. But she'd been ordered not to open the casket. But in the middle of the night, she had opened the casket and got photographs, and then got them to me. I sent them back to the pathology laboratory of Glasgow University, and they sent me back a report which said that the gentleman's fingernails had been pulled out, he'd been beaten about the face and neck, and then he had been boiled to death. And it wasn't that water had been poured on him, it was total immersion because there was a clear tide mark around his upper torso and his upper limbs. And obviously that kind of thing, and meeting the man's mother, would have a strong impression on anyone, and that had a very, very strong impression on me.
And this was, of course, Islam Karimov's regime in Uzbekistan, which the USA and the UK were very openly supporting, and had signed an agreement for their program of extraordinary rendition, which means basically exporting your prisoners to foreign countries to be tortured and interrogated because you can't do it in your own country.
Yeah, the Americans were flying people in to be tortured in Uzbekistan, and I actually knew the CIA people who did it. Tashkent, there's not a very large foreign community in Tashkent, so I used to drink beer in the same pub as the CIA people, and they would talk about quite openly about what they were doing. And I realized that we were getting intelligence reports from these torture sessions, because apart from anything else, I was having people coming to me to complain, because I'd made speeches and had a reputation for an interest in human rights. Torture victims were coming to me and telling me what information, the kind of things they'd been forced to say under torture. And those things corresponded precisely with the things I was seeing in intelligence reports. And often you knew that they weren't true. And the example I always like to give is there was one old professor in Tashkent who was named in these intelligence reports. And these are reports from the CIA and British intelligence. He was named as being a member of Al-Qaeda. And actually, I knew the man, and he was a Jehovah's Witness. There are not many Jehovah's Witnesses in Al-Qaeda. So I realized we were being fed false information, and the purpose of the false information, it was circular. The purpose of the false information was to exaggerate the strength of Al-Qaeda. And it was exaggeration of the strength of Al-Qaeda which justified our support for the regime. But that strength of Al-Qaeda wasn't really there. It was a fiction, because our support for the regime was really based on our interest in Central Asia's oil and gas reserves. That's what it was actually all about. And I was in a unique position as ambassador to see all of that.
So if you go back in time a little bit to the time of Alexander Burns, who you've written about, so things really haven't changed that much. You know, there was an interest that the British had in the subcontinent, that they had in the north, in Afghanistan, and the interests continue. And the British actually used information. They sent people like Burns out to gather that information so that they could then take over huge countries. They understood the people, what they did, how they did it. You know, they were the biggest information gatherers, and it's almost like they conquered this entire subcontinent just through gathering information. So it's almost like the same thing happened again 200 years later.
Oh yeah, I think some things never change. One of the interesting things in my research we must sell you my book. We haven't tried to persuade you to buy a book at all during
We're heading there.
You have to buy this book, because A, it's wonderful and fascinating, and B, it's very, very heavy. And if you don't buy it, I'm going to have to carry them all back to Scotland again, which is going to be, for a man of my age, is going to be hard work. So do buy it. But the way things don't change is absolutely fascinating to me. One of the things which I didn't expect to find during my research is that during the 1830s, the British were actively, here in Sindh, were actively playing off the Shia and Sunni against each other. And at that time, there were 4 emirs of Sindh, 4 brothers who governed together, or cousins. 3 of them were Shia, 3 of them were Sunni, and 1 was Shia. One of the Talpurs was Shia. And the British discussed trying to replace all the Sunni Shias, all the Sunni emirs with the Shia emir, and then using that to buy off Persia and look for a British Sind-Persian alliance to counteract Russian influence in Persia. So, and I mean, today American foreign policy in the Middle East, of which British foreign policy is merely is a kind of prisoner, but American foreign policy in the Middle East is based entirely on attempting to assert Saudi Arabian Sunni regional dominance against Iran, because the Americans realized that they'd made a mistake in handing Iraq over to Shia influence. So these games go on, and Western powers attempts to exploit precisely the same divisions, and the immorality of the motives of Western powers haven't changed at all in the course of centuries. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And yes, I mean, Alexander Burns was an extremely impressive and talented spy, I suppose would be the word. And he prepared the ground. He was the first British officer, I think, to come to Karachi. He prepared the ground for the invasion, and he's the one who initiated relationships with the Talpurs in particular. And of course, what people forget is that the first Afghan war was a disaster for the British, and they were wiped out in Afghanistan. But in the course of the first Afghan war, which started in 1839, the British captured Karachi, they captured Shikapur, they captured Sukkur and the fortress of Baiha, and those outposts were British since 1839. Then taking the rest of the country a few years later was a comparatively simple military operation.
But someone like Burns, by the way, we have in the audience here the great-great-grandson of the man who killed Burns, Ayesha, who's right there. So we'll come to that. And Burns is information gathering. But wasn't he also a double agent?
Burns was extremely conflicted. The reason I find Burns so fascinating in many ways is that he, of course, became famous for having gone to in the UK, for having made it to modern Uzbekistan. I come from the same part of Scotland as Alexander Burns, and from a similar social class, if you like. And I also faced a conflict between my principles and working for my government, and he did too, because he became extremely friendly, both with the Talpur emirs and with Dost Muhammad of Afghanistan. And Burns advised extremely strongly against the invasion. He advised the British that Dost Muhammad was a very good ruler of Afghanistan, and that British interests would be best served by supporting Dost Muhammad. But the British decided they would prefer to set up a puppet ruler. And at that stage, Burns had to make a decision to stick with the British Army, where he'd been appointed number 2 in command to go and invade Afghanistan, or to resign. And at first he did resign. He resigned, and he was talked out of it by the Governor-General. When the army reached Shikapur, he resigned again, and was again talked out of it. In the end, of course, he was killed, which just goes to show it's a bad thing not to stick to your principles. But I wouldn't call him a double agent. Double agent is Masson, I think. But Burns was certainly somebody extremely conflicted about the tasks he was doing. He wasn't from a Victorian period. One thing I think William Dalrymple has right is that in the earlier period of British colonialism, the British may have been rapacious and greedy, but they weren't racist. And Burns wasn't in any sense a racist, and he found the local culture extremely attractive. It's very possible he converted to Islam. He certainly went around posing as a Muslim, and it does appear very likely he had become privately Muslim himself. He was extremely conflicted about what he was doing.
There's also a fascinating story that Craig just told me about a family in America where they found they did the DNA testing from Burns's family, and they traced it to a Pakistani in America, and they've discovered that he's a direct descendant.
Oh.
Yeah. So Alexander Burns had a Pakistani child, well, an Indian at that time, I guess, child.
Yeah, that's true. Some direct descendants of Alexander's brother James contacted me, and and in Scotland we very often name our firstborn after the father. So there's been an unbroken line, and James Burns was Alexander's elder brother. There's been an unbroken line of James Burns for 3 centuries, and the current James Burns contacted me from America and got me to sign the book for him. And he had done the DNA testing, and it had thrown up as a relative a Pakistani engineer living in America, and he'd contacted him. And the interesting thing was, the Pakistani engineer said that the family tradition had always been that they were descended from Alexander Burns, but they'd never had any proof. And I think that's a rather lovely story.
So I also find it fascinating how you moved from your first book, Murder in Samarkand, which was about your Uzbekistan experience and about your disenchantment with the British government or the foreign policy of the British government. And then you moved on from that to the story of Alexander Burns, going back into history. What made you pick Alexander Burns as a subject after talking about today's geopolitics?
It was partly that question of looking at the reoccurring themes, because I was talking to you about the, British attempts to exploit the Shia-Sunni divide. If you look at the first British invasion of Pakistan, then the puppet ruler the British put in place, Shah Shuja, was a member of the Durrani tribe and of the Populzai branch of the Durrani tribe, 4 invasions later, when we invaded Afghanistan for the 4th time in 2002, the ruler we put in place, Muhammad Karzai, was an aristocrat from a Durrani tribe and from the Popolzai branch of the Durrani tribe. So the extent to which we repeat the mistakes of history again and again is really quite astonishing. And we ended up on the losing side in a tribal war between certain Pashtun groups against other Pashtun groups, plus the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Northern Alliance. And those were exactly the same battle lines as were fought in 2000 and are still being fought today. And if you look at the names, the place names of the battles of the first Afghan war, exactly the same places, fighting exactly the same people.
So why do you think that is? Are they using outdated intel or?
Stupidity is a major part of the explanation. I mean, we keep repeating the same. You'd think if the British had learned one thing by now, it would be don't invade Afghanistan. But we don't seem to have learned that lesson. But also, it's to do with control of resources and making the same tribal alliances still keep looking convenient to us. A lot of the time I question the use of labels. I question the use of the word Taliban to decide when you're fighting precisely the same tribal enemies you were fighting 2 centuries ago and have done it 4 times since. You can't just pick up a new name like Taliban and they become a different kind of entity. No, they are the same people, and they are people who see themselves as defending their homeland from foreign invasion. And if I had a lot of Afghans with rifles running around Edinburgh, I would shoot at them, and I don't see why we should expect Afghans to be any different if they have a lot of Scottish people with rifles running around Kabul. I'm sorry, that's possibly a slightly controversial opinion, but that willingness, that desire to try to ram home the repeated stupidity of British policy was partly what influenced me, and also it was this question of the moral question of how somebody from a similar background to me dealt with a similar dilemma.
Stupidity, dilemmas, all this. The British really tried to get you out of the Foreign Office for a long time, or the Foreign Office tried to get you fired for a long time at the Americans' behest. We understand, but it didn't work until 2004 or 6.
Yeah. The Blair's foreign policy advisor, whose name was David Manning, I think, went to Washington, and they were told that we had an ambassador in Tashkent who kept making speeches against American foreign policy, and this wasn't a good idea. And as a result, I was got rid of. I was asked to leave. And at first, they brought disciplinary charges against me. And they invented all kinds of things which I can absolutely assure you were simply not true. Like
the dolly birds.
Yeah, they used the phrase dolly birds, which is a phrase nobody in the UK has used since 1966. But I was accused. It was obviously they had a drawer full of fake charges if you want to get rid of an ambassador, which had been written in the 1960s. So I was formally accused of employing dolly birds in the visa section, which was fascinating because the visa section had an all-male staff. But I was accused of some quite horrible things. I was accused of issuing visas in exchange for sex, which is a very unpleasant thing to be accused of. I was accused of being habitually drunk at work and various other charges. And I was suspended and went through a 6-month disciplinary investigation. And to give you an example of the kind of resources they put into trying to get rid of me, one of the major, I think it was Arthur Andersen, one of the major accounting firms, they sent 4 employees from one of the major London accounting firms out to Tashkent to go through the embassy accounts to try to find something I had done wrong. And as a result of that particular exercise, I had to pay back $22 for a lunch where I had lost the receipt. I don't know what it cost to send 4 people from Arthur Andersen to Tashkent for a week, but it's a great deal more than $22, I can assure you. But they really threw the book at me. I had an extremely difficult and unpleasant time. And being Tony Blair's government, they immediately, and my good friend Peter Oborne is here, who nowadays works for the Daily Mail, but they immediately leaked the accusations against me to the Daily Mail, because that's also how the British government react. You find that anybody who is seen as a serious threat to the government has some kind of sexual allegation against him made in the newspapers, and that's what happened to me.
Well, Arthur Anderson, I guess, got their comeuppance. I think what we'll do is we'll open this to questions, because we have about 15 or 20 minutes left. So if there are any questions from the audience, we have lots. So the lady here first, then you, then you, then you. Thanks. Is there a mic? Maybe you can just stand up and... Oh, here, Mike.
Thank you for your fascinating account of the 1840s, when Burns and Sir Charles Napier, who was sent by Lord Ellenborough to annex Sindh, and he provoked the Talpurs, the Amir Talpurs, who were peace-loving, and as you said, the Shia-Sunni insurrection. So these tactics of the British early imperial session during the East India Company, and then we got the 1940s when Hugh Lambrick is up there inciting again, and the martial law of 1942 and so on. So I was wondering if in all these so-called tactics and immoral stands or strategy of the Raj to, for the annexation of India, you would see any parallel in what Bush and Blair in our times are doing on the war on terror. Do you see any similar things going on there?
I think the underlying commercial motive is the most important one. When Burns first came to Karachi, which was 1831, the reason he came was Karachi as a port was being used by the Portuguese to export opium. And opium was coming down the Indus, being exported out of here by the Portuguese. And the British were trying to enforce a complete monopoly of the opium trade. And much of the motive for the first Afghan war was opium. Now then, it is a fact. People argue about why and exactly how. But it is a fact that whilst the Taliban were in charge in Afghanistan, one thing that undoubtedly happened is there was a massive fall in opium production in Afghanistan. Since the Western invasion and the Western-sponsored governments have been back in power, opium production in Afghanistan is now double what it ever was before 2001. And not only that, it's about the only country where Western intervention has actually achieved what it always claims it's going to achieve economically, which is value added. Because in 2000, Afghanistan exported raw opium. Nowadays, it almost entirely exports processed heroin. So we've actually created an industry. It's about the only place where Western intervention has successfully created an industry. Unfortunately, it's the heroin industry. I think you'll find economic motives behind it all the time. I'm not claiming the motive for the Western invasion for Afghanistan was entirely opium. It was much more oil and gas related. It's worth knowing that while George W. Bush was governor of Texas, he had a meeting in his office with Enron. I don't know if you remember the Enron scandal. He had a meeting in the governor's office in Texas with Enron and Sadiq Safayev, who at the time was Uzbek ambassador to the United States. And they signed a deal for Enron to take Uzbekistan's gas and export it through a pipeline over Afghanistan down to the Arabian sea. So the Bush family was involved, and I forget the name of the company. You'll find it in Murder in Samarkand. And President Bush Sr. was director of the company which was to build the pipeline. So they had Enron tied up, and they had the pipeline company tied up. And the Bush family's economic interest in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan predates 2001 by about 10 years. And it was the oil and gas they were after. And in the 19th century, opium, in present day oil and gas, you always find that follow the money. The real motive behind them is always grabbing hold of resources and grabbing a monopoly of resources because they're not interested in competition.
Sorry, but this person was first, then next to them, then him, and then you.
And
G.
me also afterwards. One
Yeah.
more, please.
Right here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's quite a fascinating subject you brought on over here. I worked with a multinational and I've been in Nigeria. I lived in Africa for a long time.
Sorry, can't hear you.
I've lived in Africa for a long time, from north to south to middle. We were based in Kinshasa. So I could see how the mining companies were doing business in a certain way and how the governments were overturned. So it basically brings out a simple fact that all politics is run by business. And everything that you still see today is a reflection of what you're saying. Now, my question in the end is that have you been able to convince the people in UK and the public at large about these things, or does it become a storybook and then goes into the shelf and never talked about again? Because we don't hear a lot of it from the UK, but we hear about it when people like you come out and do an expose. WikiLeaks is there, he's been shut down in a corner, somebody else is somewhere else. So how is it going to change if you can bring things out then?
Well, I think there is an increasing public awareness. I think even when I first started saying these things 10, 12 years ago, they came as quite a shock to quite a lot of people to hear these things. A lot of people didn't want to believe me. I don't get that anymore. Most people accept that what I'm saying is actually a valid analysis of the way the world's worked, and that I've seen it from the inside, and therefore have information on it I can helpfully get. But the fundamental analysis that Western politics in particular is extremely corrupt and controlled by money no longer really surprises people. Whether people feel they can do anything about it is a different question. And I think one of the things, we're at a period of development at the moment where the gap between wealthy and the poor, and even wealthy and ordinary people, is becoming huge. In the UK, ordinary middle-class people, their children can't possibly afford to buy a house. House prices in the UK are, I think, throughout the country, 8 times average salary, and in London, 12 times average salary. So, and that's average house prices. Whereas we now have, I think, 120 billionaires in the UK, and it's always been the case that there's been a massive disparity between the wealthy countries and the developing world, or at least since imperialism, there's been that massive disparity. But now the disparity within countries is becoming greater and greater, and there's no doubt at all. The government in the UK is very fond of bringing out a statistic of saying that the gap between the top 10% and the bottom 10% is shrinking. And that's actually true. But the gap between the top 2% and the other 98% is massively, massively expanding. And there is a feeling of alienation in society. And some things like, and it's being filled by, the resentment that causes is being filled by populism. And unfortunately, a narrative has taken. It's been very easy because, of course, if you're the controlling elite, if you're the corporate people who own the media, you don't. The narrative has been spun that if you are poor and you have a badly paid job and you can't afford a house, it's the fault of the immigrant. It's that poor immigrant who has made you poor. Whereas in fact, it's the super wealthy who are stealing all the money who have made you poor. It's not the poor immigrant. He doesn't have any money either. So the ability to divert popular discontent into racism is a very worrying thing. And the diversion of popular discontent into racism is the direct cause of Trump in the States and is the direct cause of Brexit, because both were based on very, very nasty, racist, anti-immigrant campaigns. So popular anger and resentment is there, an understanding that the world is fixed against ordinary people, an understanding that the Western democratic model doesn't really work for ordinary people anymore is there. And please don't ask me what we do about it, because I have no idea. But that anger is too easily diverted by those who control the media. And of course, those who control the media are the 1% stealing all the money.
So over here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So most governments work on the principle of exigency and self-interest. Why do you think ethics and morality should play a role in foreign policy, and should it? And my second question is it better to leave despotic regimes and rulers like Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein in place than to go for regime change and then cause havoc for decades to come?
Yep.
Go ahead. Just take the mic.
They're both good questions. The first question is to me self-evident in that I think all areas of society have to be governed by ethics. Otherwise, the interrelations between humans become based purely on power and violence. And state sanction is violence. Even those parts of state sanction, like court system or the prison system or the police, they're actually based on the state's monopoly of violence. And if a state's not ethical, then at the end of the day, it's based on nothing but its ability to use violence to enforce the allocation of resources which it has chosen to do. And that's always going to lead eventually to insurrection and more violence. So I think states have to be ethical. Whether it's better to leave... one of the things which I frequently said in my reporting back from Tashkent was that here in Uzbekistan, we are actively supporting the dictator Islam Karimov, who's a terrible tyrant and possibly an even worse tyrant than Saddam Hussein. And yet, we're supposed to be overthrowing Saddam Hussein because of his human rights record. And because we made speeches to that effect. Tony Blair and George Bush made speeches to that effect. And I think one thing that has to be understood is that the West has never, ever enacted regime change because of a genuine concern for the human rights record or genuine concern for the people of that country. We didn't go to war to get rid of Gaddafi or to get rid of Hussein because anybody cared about the people of Iraq or Libya. That was a pretext. I mean, both of them were resource grabs. I wouldn't advocate. I dislike enormously the Central Asian dictatorships, but if the West were to intervene and militarily depose them, it would just make matters far, far worse. The way to improve both human rights and resource allocation is through steady progress, and sometimes that's extremely frustrating. Often it's extremely frustration, it's slow, but the attempt to do it quickly but by military intervention just does not work. It doesn't work at all. And it is remarkable that, now, for example, Saudi Arabia has undoubtedly a far, far, far worse human rights record than Venezuela. Venezuela has a poor human rights record at present, but it's a hell of a lot more. The question of whether the president's election was rigged or the extent to which it was rigged, there are arguments both sides. It certainly wasn't a perfect election. but it was a hell of a lot more democratic than the election of the ruler of Saudi Arabia. The idea that we are attempting to depose a president of Venezuela because of his human rights record is bullshit. It's because of attempts to get hold of the world's largest oil reserves. Because unlike the Saudis, who do make the oil reserves available to the West, the Venezuelans don't. And so never ever believe the propaganda behind regime change, because it is never ever true. And the fact that we never actually choose to do it anywhere that doesn't have oil and gas reserves should be sufficient of a clue.
My question is regarding the ever-famous Burns Road in Karachi, Karachi as it was pronounced by the Britishers. So, why it was named after Alexander Burns, and did he do anything philanthropic acts for the Karachi city? And my second question is regarding his name. As you said that he converted to Islam later on. So why did he name Sikandar? Why did he name himself Sikandar? Was he inspired of Alexander the Great, who conquered Indus Valley some thousands of years ago?
I should say he was very much inspired by Alexander the Great, and he was quite vain of the fact that because his name was Alexander, so people here naturally called him Secunda. It came about not of his doing, if you like. It's just what people called him when he introduced himself as Alexander. I think it's quite likely he was privately converted to Islam. When he met Munad Ali Khan Talpur the first time, for example, Munad Ali Khan noted that Burns repeated the Islamic Declaration of Faith 3 times, which apparently is a formula used to indicate, for example. I don't think he was doing that purely as a kind of ruse. Burns' private diaries were destroyed by the Victorian historian John Kay, who also destroyed the papers of John Lawrence and several other of the major figures of British India. In the case of John Lawrence, he almost certainly destroyed them to remove evidence of homosexuality. In the case of Burns, I think it's very likely he destroyed them to remove evidence of non-Christian religious thought. Because, of course, if you were a Victorian historian writing about the giants of British India, the great heroes, they had to be perfect. They couldn't possibly be homosexual, which a Victorian would regard as not acceptable, and they couldn't possibly have non-Christian political religious views. One thing I haven't spoken of is that Burns was a Freemason, and his brother James Burns became the head Freemason of all India. And the history of Freemasonry and Freemasonry, almost all the senior officers of the East India Company were Freemasons. Lord Dalhousie, for example, was Governor General of India and at the same time head of all Freemasonry worldwide. One of the interesting things about Freemasonry is that there's a great Eastern influence on it. And you could become a Mason if you were a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew. If you believed in one God, you could become a Freemason. There is an element of Freemasonry, I'm quite sure, which is that it allowed British officers who were living in a Muslim environment, living among Muslims, 90% of them had Muslim sexual partners, whether or not they were formally married, and many more of them were formally married than is nowadays admitted. It allowed them to reconcile their religion. And in those days, it was not socially acceptable for them to come out as not Christian or to admit any doubt about the divinity of Christ. But in Freemasonry, they could meet together and they could discuss divinity without accepting the divinity of Christ. So I think Freemasonry itself is very misunderstood. And it's quite interesting because it's particularly been misunderstood by some strong Muslim scholars who are very anti-Freemasonry, whereas in fact it was designed in many ways, or it was used as a secret way, in secret, and this is partly why it was secret, for British officers to express their Muslim sympathies.
Also, just for the record, the Freemasons Lodge is right across the road here. It's the Sindh Wildlife Office. It's a very beautiful building. And the other thing about the Freemasons was that they believed in equality. So no matter what your ethnic background, you could all sit together, which was unusual for British or the colonial period. Sorry, question?
Amina has just asked me to introduce the gentleman who is the great-great-grandson of
We just did.
Abdullah Achakzai, the guy who actually...
He has a question.
Yeah,
so
the guy who actually got Burns killed, Alexander Burns in Kabul. But William Dalrymple accuses him that the reason was the slave girl. And both Alexander and Abdullah were actually an enmity on that. That is one side of the story. The other thing is that you're saying that he was a Freemason and he was a grand master, Alexander Burns. And he also found something mysterious there in Afghanistan, which he attributed to the antiquity of Freemasonry. But generally it is believed that Freemasonry is actually a satanic cult. And how could somebody in satanic cult got converted? The other thing is that it's also believed that his conversion, his alleged or suspected conversion, was not because he was into Islam, but excessive interest of him into the Muslim women in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Can you give the mic?
Should we do two at once? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. First thing, I don't think Freemasonry is a satanic cult. I'm not a Freemason myself. And it's true, Burns told meetings of Freemasonry when he got back to Scotland that he had discovered materials on his travels through Afghanistan and Central Asia. He discovered inscriptions and materials which revealed that Freemasonic secrets dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. And this led to, now, not being a Freemason, I don't know what these secrets and materials exactly are that he discovered. But of course, one generation later, a famous Freemason in Lahore, Rudyard Kipling, heard those stories. And he wrote A Man Who Would Be King, based on Alexander Burns and his discovery of these Freemasonic symbols. And the Freemasons like to believe their religion or their beliefs are handed down from the time of Solomon through Egypt and through Alexander the Great to the present day. So the discovery by Burns, and Burns did archaeological excavation everywhere he did, which is another interesting discovery by Burns of materials which he claimed linked to Freemasonry was of great interest to them. One thing, it was Alexander's brother James who became the Grand Master of all India, of which in those days included Pakistan, of the Freemasons. One thing which the Burns brothers did was it was they who opened up Freemasonry to all races. Prior to them, it was British only. And that's why the Burns brothers became so highly thought of. And that's actually why Burns Road was named after them. It was actually the Freemasons who in those days among local people were very powerful in Karachi. It was actually the Freemasons who had Burns Road named after the Burns.
We have a question from Ayaz also. We have to wrap up very quickly.
Okay.
Ayaz?
Hi. So we spoke earlier. Just a quick, like something that I wanted to always ask was, so this sort of revolt that happened like in Afghanistan, how come you don't see such a revolt happening in all of India? So when the British would absorb a state, until you come up to 1857, which some people say was caused by the loss in Afghanistan and the loss of face. Why was the reaction of like Afghans different from the reaction of the native Indian from Bengal all the way to the Punjab? That when the British would take them over, nobody would just sort of revolt en masse. So that's question number one. Question number two is how did each side view the heroes like of the other side? So if you read the like Afghan sources, Burns is the conniving devil who's always out there like in the shadows. And if you read the British sources, so my great grandfather is a barbarian and so was he the Afghan Nicholson who fought his way through, or where does the middle ground stand? Thanks.
Well, I have to keep it short because we have to finish back. But it's interesting because one of the reasons I wrote the book was that the stories of the British Empire and imperial past fall into two camps, in much the way you say. There are stories in which the British were all devils and absolutely terrible people who came in and raped and pillaged and exploited and killed, and there's a great deal of truth in that. And there are other stories in which they were noble people with a civilizing mission, and there's a certain amount of truth in that. And what I was trying to do was to find where the truth lies and find a synthesis and find how somebody like Alexander Burns, who undoubtedly was not, as a person, inherently evil or ill-motivated, and who himself, I mean, he became incredibly disillusioned with the British. He said that the British, one day, Indians will look back and will see the British as having been a terrible plague and a worse enemy than past invading hordes. So he himself had huge scruples about what was going on. On your ancestor, I'm sorry to say, but the British sources are very rude. But interestingly enough, there are British sources. Mount Stuart Elphinstone in 1819, so a long while before the first Afghan war. He wrote that the Achakzai clan were the worst looters and pillagers on the trade routes of Afghanistan. And in 1831, Arthur Connolly passed through and was briefly held prisoner by your ancestor, Arthur Connolly. And he wrote that your ancestor practiced terrible torture and exactions on his own peasantry. So and those were a long while before the British invasion of Afghanistan. So I think your own ancestor, who is nowadays seen as a great patriot, I'm sure, like everyone, he was a human with his good side and his bad side.
Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I've just been told we have to wrap up. There are a million things we could talk about, but I think you should get the book and read it, because the style in which it's been written is a lot like Burns' life himself. It's Burns, the information gatherer, so you have Craig Murray, information gatherer, and God knows what he's out to conquer. Hopefully our minds. But there were so many other things we could have talked about. Hizbul Tahrir and how they operate in Pakistan. The Islamic movement for Uzbekistan and how they're really behind pretty much every terrorist attack that's taken place recently all over the place. Lots of other questions. And if you want to get the book and get it signed, please do. Thank you all very much. Wonderful audience. Thank you, Craig Murray. Thank you, Arieb Azhar.